welcome you all and thank you for being here during what I know on campus is the busiest time of the entire school year. So thank you for being here. We want to especially welcome Luke's family. Welcome to all. We're thrilled that you're here. And I also welcome alum who have come back to be with us. This is a grand time to have you here. So when Luke approached me about doing an academic partners project, and he sent me his proposal, he's heard me say this. When I got the proposal, my initial response was, I have a soulmate. And indeed, I have a soulmate. It's just been such a joy, pursuing joy with him. Time does not allow me to recount his many recognitions and prizes during his time here. I saw him receive 2 just last night. But those of you that have studied with Luke, you know him. You know him. And we all thank God that we know him. So help me to welcome him.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to Dr. Kilpatrick. Without whom I could not have even begun this project, let alone completed it. And thank you also to so many of you who have helped me make it to this place. But I want to talk to you today about fairy tales and the genre that has become fantasy in the modern world. And so, like any good fairy tale, we have to start with once upon a time, there was a boy who got sick. And this boy, in his sickness, spent about 6 hours trying to distract himself from his fever, his aches, and his chills by listening to The Silver Chair over and over again by C.S. Lewis, The Silver Chair on audio cassette. And at the end of every read through of The Silver Chair, they would come to the passage where it talks about Underland being flooded and the mountain being stripped away from Underland, and there being vast underwater caves where Narnians would go down on cool summer days and float about and go boating. And it ends with the admonition from Lewis, if you ever have the good luck to go to Narnia yourself, do not forget to have a look at those caves. And this boy, who was me, in case you didn't know, felt something that he could only barely describe. He felt it was like his heart was breaking, because the caves were right there, so close, and he couldn't get down into them. And he felt what C.S. Lewis would call later joy, which Lewis called an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. Lewis says this is a technical term. It's different. It's not pleasure. It's not happiness. The only thing that it has in common with those is that anyone who has had it will want ever after to have it again. But aside from that, it might almost be called a form of grief or pain. The joy, Tolkien also calls it joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. And what I realized growing up was that I found this joy most often when I was reading fairy tales or fantasy. I felt that this joy, it wasn't an emotional state, it wasn't some purely subjective thing that I could arouse at will. It had to be something, some experience that was beyond me, not something purely subjective. And so I want to talk to you about the reason I think fantasy literature arouses this so often. Because Tolkien has the notion of a sub-creator. Man, in any literary work, man has created a subworld which you read and you enter into. Even a historian who's telling true things creates a memory in some ways, and you have to enter into that. But fantasy is the farthest from the primary reality we know, and because of this, it takes the familiar and flips it on its head and lets us see it in a new way that we've never seen it before, in a way that lets us get down to the deepest, really true, mythic, in the true sense of myth, the ways reality functions at its deepest level. And Tolkien argues that fairy tales and fantasy give us three things. He calls them recovery, which is the defamiliarization, the ability to see something fresh and new in what's been familiar and what we've so often become so familiar with that we don't even bother to look at it anymore. But he also talks about consolation, and the consolation that the true fairy story always ends with a happy ending, with a happily ever after. And in that, he defines it as coming from what he calls eucatastrophe, which he says the eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. So, first, we should avoid two errors about eucatastrophe. First of all, eucatastrophe is a good catastrophe. It's a turn away from evil, from destruction, to an unrepeatable, utterly unexpected moment of grace. And at a Christian college where the cross is at the center of everything we do, that should sound pretty familiar to all of you, because the incarnation is the real catastrophe. But Tolkien would be the very first to say, to remember, eucatastrophe does not deny evil. It does not deny death. But it promises a resurrection which is beyond that. It does not deny the problems of the world, but it only says that there is a happy ending beyond them. The only thing it denies is that evil and sin and death in the world are not all there is. There is something still beyond these, and all of the promises of Christ and the fantasy, yes, maybe yes and amen in the end. So, what Tolkien further argues, and what I would also argue, is that the incarnation, the cross, and the resurrection, they are the real eucatastrophe, but they also legitimize eucatastrophe in stories. The fairy tale is real in some sense, because it reaches the happy ending. And that happy ending, the promise of goodness, of beauty, of joy, this unsatisfied desire, perhaps unsatisfiable desire in our world, is really only a signpost to divine beauty, to the perfect thing which is beyond the walls of this world. And Lewis says that if we find ourselves unsatisfied in this world, if we find ourselves homesick at home, it's most probable that it's because we were made for another world. So this is where eucatastrophe points us. And the last thing Tolkien says fairy stories offer us is escape. An escape from, not from reality, not simply an escapist fantasy. It's not, I may get in trouble for saying that this is a Christian college, but it's not an acid trip. It's not a hallucination that gets you out of reality. It's not getting high to get free. It's remembering something that's really true about the world. But what it is, what escape can offer us is an escape first from the simple banality of life, the everyday grind, the weariness of everyday existence, but it can also free us from ideology, from bad stories that we tell ourselves. And Tolkien, as someone who lived through 2 world wars, was all too familiar with bad ideologies and bad stories. But I want to talk to you today and apply some of this to someone who came before Tolkien. His name was Lord Dunsany. 3 of you, I think, have heard of him before. Well, probably more, but only because I've been going around campus saying, "Have you heard of this man? Ever?" But he was an Anglo-Irish peer, born in 1878 in London, and he grew up in between England, in Kent, and in Ireland. He served in the Second Boer War, and after this, he enjoyed, from about 1906 to 1914, 8 of the most beautiful golden years of, I think, any man's life. He became an author, he wrote plays and short stories, both of which he was an acknowledged master of. He was not a Christian, but he was fascinated by the fantastic, by the tales of elves and things that are beyond us, what Tolkien calls the perilous realm. And then, into these happy golden years of his life, as they came to so many happy golden years, came World War I. And Dunsany, a great hunter, pistol-shooting champion of Ireland, and nothing if not a man of action, was a captain in the Irish Guard. He was sent to France and he fought on the front lines of the war at several major battles. He lost over a dozen close friends. He likely received shell shock and PTSD, although his letters, he's a very private man in some cases. He doesn't talk really about that. But he came during World War I to write a poem called Songs from the Evil Wood, in which he looks at the stars and he asks, why do they not scream out and grapple star against star, seeking for blood in the wood, as all things round me are. So he, even though not a Christian, Dunsany finds himself forced to cry out to some sort of higher power, to some sort of cosmic authority, and ask, where is justice? How can men do this to one another? And for him, in some ways, because he was Anglo-Irish and because he was strongly against Irish home rule, in some ways, for him, even after the war ended, the war never ended, because he returns to an Ireland that's in the middle of revolt and constant conflict between the Sinn Féin and the British Parliament. And so he lives much of the rest of his life under the shadow of violence. But he comes out of the war, and the first thing he doesn't write plays, he doesn't write poetry, he starts writing fairy tales after the war. And I want to talk to you about probably his greatest and most enduring fairy tale. It's a novel, it's called The King of Elfland's Daughter. It was written and published in 1924, in which he tells us a story about this prince from a land called, a village called Earl, the Parliament of Earl wishes to be ruled by a magic lord. And so they send Alberic, their lord's son, over the border into Elfland to woo the King of Elfland's daughter. None of you saw that coming. But Alberic goes and he woos the King of Elfland's daughter, Lirazel. He woos her, he brings her back. They do have, well, first he goes to a witch, and he acquires a magic sword, because this is a fairy tale, and you have to have a magic sword somewhere. He goes there, he brings a magic sword, and he takes it into fairyland, and after adventures and defeating various knights, he wins the hand of Lirazel, and he brings her back to Earl. And Lirazel, because Lirazel is with him, he starts to recover his vision of the everyday, ordinary fields. He sees, because she is seeing them for the first time, he starts to recognize a beauty in buttercups that he had never seen before, and a humor in hearts that had henceforth been unknown to him. So he brings her back, and then they have a son. There's a couple of happy golden years, similar to what Dunsany had before the war. And then the king of Elfland recalls his daughter to him. He sends her a rune, and because of various differences, she reads the rune, she is recalled, and the king of Elfland draws away Elfland from the borders of Earl across a span that it would weary a comet to cross, or so says Dunsany. Alveric proceeds to seek after Lyrazel. He enters the desert, and he looks and he seeks after Elfland, but he cannot cross the desert. And so he decides, I will set out on a quest. Because again, this is a fairy tale, and you have to have a quest somewhere. The more quests, the better. So he goes north. He takes a group of madmen, because no sane man would really go seeking for Elfland. And he goes north, and he seeks for Lyrazel for nearly 20 years. And at long last, he gives up, and he comes back. And Lyrazel, too, had spent all this time in the palace that may be told of only in song, the king of Elfland's palace. And she's been weeping for him, and longing to go back to him and to their son Orion, also for about 20 years. And then, after this time has passed, Alveric gives up. He returns. And it is then when the king of Elfland, in a move which is totally unforeseen by the reader, I think, gives up and says, all right, fine, Lyrazel, I'll bring Elfland back. And he does. He makes this great sacrifice. He takes his last great magic rune, the last true power he has, and he extends Elfland. And he reaches out, and so Elfland embraces Earl. And it wraps up Earl. And just as Alveric comes back, Elfland, like a shining line, pours over the borders and over the village of Earl, and all of Earl is enchanted. And Elfland and magic are recovered by the people of Earl. And so, we have our eucatastrophe, our unexpected, impossible to repeat turn, the end, that Elfland and Earl are one, that we have the meshing of the two worlds, and this promise that you can really have this, it's the arousal of joy, and also the promise that what has brought the joy, that the impossible beauty of Elfland can come to mortal men. And mortal and magical are bound together. And for Dunsany, I think I would argue, for Dunsany, magic is the closest term to, is the closest thing, the closest he can get to naming that thing we cannot name, that thing which Tolkien and Lewis called joy, which Dunsany calls magic. And Dunsany writes this book, though not just, well, perhaps just because he wanted to write a fairy tale. But he also writes it, this is a man who has walked through hell on earth, who has seen his friends die around him, and he writes it as a way to bring us hope, I think. And this, I would argue, is the true purpose of fantasy literature, the highest and best form of fantasy literature, true fairy tales, not just tales about fairies, but a true fairy tale, which has this eucatastrophe. It offers us joy and hope and the possibility that there is actually something beyond the ordinary material stuff that makes up our everyday. And a little before Elfland and Earl come together, the Parliament of Earl they go to the witch who Alberic had gone to earlier, and various signs of Elfland are starting to come over the border, but Elfland hasn't flowed all the way over yet. And the Parliament of Earl goes to Zerundarel, the witch, and they go, "There is too much magic. Get rid of it. Please, give us a charm against magic." And Zerundarel, who probably should have pointed out, "Guys, you were the ones who wanted to be ruled by a magic lord. What are you saying now?" says, "Poor indeed were we without magic, whereof we are well stored to the envy of darkness and space." And I think what Dunsany means by space, and what Zerundarel means by space also, is the philosophy that he saw creeping in around him everywhere, this materialistic thing, which for him, as for Tolkien and for Lewis, was exemplified by Nazi Germany. That things are only things that we may use. And Zerundarel has this lovely passage in which she says, very angrily, "I would sooner give you a charm against water, that all the world should thirst and die at, than I would give you a charm against the songs of streams. I would sooner give you a charm against bread, that all the world should starve, than I would give you a charm against the magic of ripe wheat in summer nights, among whom stalks go, how many of whom man knows nothing." This promise that there is the promise in the ripe wheat, in the songs of the streams, that there is something beyond our ordinary reality. There is something of spirit and magic, something which makes, something of beauty, which enchants the world, which cannot be bought, cannot be sold, cannot be used to our own ends simply, but which has worth in and of itself, and which points upward through magic, through art, to joy itself, and ultimately, for the Christian, I would argue, to God. And I would reiterate, Dunsany is not a Christian. He had no, and has no particular view of the afterlife, but even he saw the necessity of remembering that we do live in an enchanted world, in a world in which magic, beauty, joy do really exist, and they point upward to something beyond us. And that, I think he would argue, as Tolkien would argue, as Lewis would argue, and what I would also argue today to you, is the true purpose of fairy tales and true fantasy.